Hi, I'm David Manti with Cannabis Equipment News, and with me today is Chris Simpson. He's a professor at the University of Washington and also the author of the editorial Occupational Health and Safety in the Cannabis Industry. Thank you very much for joining me today, Chris.
Thank you, David. It's my pleasure to talk to you today.
Awesome. Well, if you could start by telling me a little bit about yourself and your role in the cannabis space, specifically as it pertains to employee safety.
Sure. So I'm a professor here at the University of Washington in Seattle, and my specialization is occupational health and safety. As you know, Washington was one of the first states in the nation to legalize adult recreational use of cannabis. And as an occupational health and safety professional, it seemed important that my department get involved in the cannabis space, learn about the occupational health hazards that would be faced by workers in this newly legal industry, help to identify any of those hazards that might be present, and help the businesses and the workers develop strategies to protect the workers from hazards within this industry.
Okay. And from what you've seen, what does the safety landscape look like in the industry today?
It's I would say that it is variable. The industry, because it had not previously been legal, and because it is still considered illegal at the federal level, there was a lack of research on what the hazards are that are prevalent within this industry. And there's certainly a lack of guidance from the kinds of federal agencies such as OSHA or such as the EPA that are responsible for regulating health and safety in other industries. So both the states that legalized marijuana and the employers themselves were at a bit of a disadvantage in not having this background of health and safety information available that they could turn to in order to set up their processes in a way that were protective for the workers. I would say that.
Oh, go ahead.
That in many cases, the kinds of hazards that we see in production of cannabis are similar to what is seen in other areas of agriculture or horticulture. And so much of what we have learned from the agricultural industry can be applied to protect the health of workers in the cannabis industry. That said, there are some exposures that are relatively unique to the cannabis industry. And it's those areas where there's need for additional research in order to understand what the hazards would be associated with those unique exposures and to control them appropriately.
So one of the things that I found really interesting is that because there is no sort of oversight from an OSHA or EPA, and states and companies are doing this on their own, from what you've seen, what are some of the states that are doing the best? And are there any specific companies that you've seen that are doing a particularly good job?
So I can speak with knowledge about Washington State specifically, not so much about the other states, but I do know that the states do share information with each other in terms of best practices, and the states that have legalized more recently have certainly turned to Washington and Colorado and latterly to California to learn from the experience of those states that legalized early. Within the industry in Washington State, I would say that in general, employers want to do the right thing and want to make sure that their workplaces are safe and healthy for the workers. Many of the people involved in the cannabis industry are very strong proponents of cannabis as a medicine, cannabis that improves the quality of life for a lot of people. and therefore a consistent, healthy and safe workplace is consistent with the values that they see for the cannabis industry. So they certainly try and follow the regulations that the state has put in place. It is challenging because those regulations have evolved over time as we learn more about how to regulate the industry, how to do things in a safe way. And as I mentioned, it's also challenging in that there's not the same federal resources available for this particular industry. The state of Washington has done a good job, I think, of putting together a web portal that provides information to employers in terms of what's required under the state health and safety regulations. And the consultants have industrial hygiene consultants have also stepped up in terms of trying to provide guidance to workplaces in terms of implementing health and safety plans.
Okay. As cannabis production has expanded in Washington, how have safety protocols kept up? You say that in general, the workforce has wellness on the mind, but what sort of, from an operational level, has happened regarding safety in the workplace?
So I think initially a lot of the hazards that we saw were essentially associated with construction of new infrastructure, and so there was a lot of incidents of injury, construction type injuries, slips, trips, falls, things like that. The kind of things that you would expect with new construction. I think more, excuse me. More recently, as the industry has started to mature, the concerns that we're seeing are perhaps more related to respiratory exposures. There's evidence that the cannabis plant, either particles from the dried plant, perhaps, or the semi-volatile chemicals, the vapors or aromas that are given off by the plant. Either of those exposures could potentially be allergenic or cause an irritant type reaction. We don't know what component of the plant might be responsible for that, but we do see evidence that, at least in some people, there is an irritant or an allergic reaction. And as awareness of that health risk has increased, certainly workplaces have started to implement respirator training type programs, so allowing workers to wear respirators, at least for specific tasks that might generate high levels of dust, for example. Okay. And making sure that the workers know how to use those respirators safely, that they get appropriately fit tested, the kind of things that we've been hearing a lot about in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic with healthcare workers.
Right. Well, one of the things that I found interesting also was that some of the data was hard to kind of separate because there's such a large number of recreational users in the industry. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges that presents to going forward?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The data that we've collected so far in terms of health measurements has been with a relatively small number of workers and a small number of workplaces. And as you mentioned, many of those workers, they're exposed to cannabis on the job, but they also use cannabis either recreational for recreational use or medicinally. When we tested the lung function or collected information on respiratory symptoms from those workers, we did see a relatively high prevalence of respiratory symptoms and a relatively high prevalence of impairment of their lung function. because most of those workers were also specifically smoking cannabis, with the data that we have, it's essentially impossible for us to disentangle the effect of the exposure at work versus the exposure through cannabis use outside of the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
So that's certainly an area that needs to be addressed with future research to try and understand whether those respiratory effects are due to the use of the smoking of cannabis itself, or whether they're due to handling cannabis in the workplace.
Mm-hmm. What I was also interested in is that, for being a fairly new industry, there's 100,000 to 150,000 workers currently in it. I wanted to know what your expectations were in terms of how many people this industry is going to employ going forward.
That's a great question. The projections for continued rapid growth, certainly across the US, and we're seeing internationally more and more countries coming online in terms of opening up use of cannabis, either medicinally or for recreational use. I think in some of the states that legalized cannabis early on, such as Washington and Colorado, I think we're starting to see something of a plateau in the workforce, especially on the production side. At least in Washington State, there have been issues in terms of maybe there were a large number of producer licenses issued. Maybe there's too many people trying to produce such that many of them are not able to turn a profit because there's too many people trying to produce and not enough retail outlets. I'm not sure whether the market in Washington State is saturated at the moment or not. We can certainly gather some of that information for you. But certainly there's additional states coming online, and so the expectation is that the cannabis workforce will continue to increase. And recently, the space around the production of hemp has also become more permissible. The hemp, of course, is biologically the same plant as cannabis, just with it produces much lower levels of the cannabinoids. But we would anticipate that the same kinds of health issues that are important for workers in cannabis production would also be important for workers in hemp production.
You had mentioned that comparatively, it's there are standards in the agricultural sector that would be applicable to the cannabis industry. Is there any what specific parts of the agricultural industry do you think people should look at first in terms of sort of best practices or what to kind of fold into their safety management protocol?
Sure. So certainly one of one example of the difference as far as cannabis is concerned from the rest of agriculture is the issue regarding pesticides. Mm-hmm. So for pretty much any other commercial crop in the US, the EPA permits use of specific pesticides on specific crops at specific times. And the regulation around the use of those pesticides indicates how those pesticides should be applied and the kinds of protection that the workers would be required to wear when those pesticides are being applied. None of that information is available for cannabis. The EPA is prohibited from doing those kinds of studies. Mm-hmm. And so individual states have had to essentially make their best guesses in terms of deciding what pesticides will be permitted for use on cannabis. They have tended to permit use of the less toxic pesticides in order to be cautious. the way cannabis is used is different to most of the other crops that are used, and so there's certainly questions about appropriate use of pesticides on cannabis. As the cannabis plant gets extracted and the cannabinoids get concentrated out of the leaves of the cannabis plant, that also can concentrate some of the pesticides that have been used. And I know in Washington State, we've had issues where a particular batch of the raw crop would pass our regulations in terms of being safe as far as the levels of pesticide are concerned. But then when that crop is then sold on to a secondary producer who then extracts the active ingredients, the extract can then fail the pesticide regulations because some of those pesticides have been concentrated in the process. So there's definitely more information needed and to guide the producers in terms of how to be able to use pesticides safely with their crops.
Okay. Talking about extraction and kind of looking at the entire production process of cannabis as a whole, are there any parts of the process that are more risky than others that should maybe be a focal point initially regarding safety standards? Tell me a little bit about everything from growing through extraction and processing, manufacturing.
Sure. So I think it's fair to say that the occupational health hazards differ at different stages of the process.
Mm-hmm.
So in the initial growing of the small plants and so on, perhaps a lot of the issues at that point are ergonomic issues. So they relate to moving around. If it's an indoor grow facility, the workers might be physically moving hundreds of 1 gallon or 5 gallon pots, moving them from room to room, or relatively detail-oriented work, growing the seedlings and then transplanting the seedlings from the smaller pots to the larger pots. There may be some concerns associated with exposure to plant nutrients or rooting hormones and so on at that stage of the process, but generally chemical exposures are not too great of a concern at that stage. Once the plant is maturing, that's kind of the stage that pesticides might be applied, and so that there might be a risk with the pesticide exposure at that point. Once the plant has matured and the flower has set, the plants then get harvested, and then typically they get hung inside in a drying area. And at that point, with a large volume of wet plant material being hung indoors, if the environment is not controlled adequately, there's a risk for mold or fungi to grow on the crop, and then the workers could be exposed to allergens from the mold and fungi. The environment within those grow rooms, especially when the fresh plant has just been harvested, the aroma is very intense from the terpenes that are present in the cannabis plant, and that's a potential allergen or irritant exposure to the workers. And then once the plant has been dried, then the workers may be hand trimming the flower. That could provide a risk for a repetitive strain injury to the hands, for example. They'll be crushing the dried flower, packaging it into pre-rolled joints, for example. And at that point, there's a risk for inhaling the dust from the plant. The plant itself, that dust may be allergenic. If mold or fungus had been growing on the crop, that's a point where the workers might be inhaling the spores from the mold and fungus, and that could cause an irritant or allergic reaction within their airways. And then on the post-processing side of it, initially there was some issues with exposure to the solvents that we used to extract the cannabis, the cannabinoids from the plant. and even risk for explosion if those solvents were not handled appropriately, or if the equipment that was used for doing um, the extractions was not put together in a safe way and maintained such that the solvent vapors didn't leak out and create an explosive atmosphere.
Okay. One of the things that I've talked about, particularly with some of the equipment manufacturers that are putting new automation and new technology into some of these cultivators, is that a lot of the risk and safety hazards comes from a lack of knowledge of how to use new equipment, or the fact that some of these companies aren't really embracing new manufacturing technologies. Could you talk a little bit about how bringing in some of this automation, might help solve some of these problems?
Sure. So there's actually two sides to that question. So certainly in in agriculture in general, there's been a big push to engineer safety into the new equipment that is being sold for production and so on. And certainly that's the kind of thing that could be incorporated into equipment that's being used in cannabis production. One can incorporate local exhaust ventilation into the machines that are used for grinding up the cannabis, for packing the pre-roll joints, and for sifting the flour and things like that. One of the challenges for the employers is that many of them are small businesses. They don't necessarily have large amounts of money that they can invest in the industry. Because of the federal regulations around banking for cannabis, the employers can't deduct investment in the company as a tax deductible expense. It's much harder for them to get loans from banks and so on to invest in infrastructure for their businesses. The new equipment that we were talking about, that's a significant capital expense up front. And if you don't have the ability to borrow the money in order to make that purchase, it's going to be much less likely that you'll be able to make that investment to protect the workforce.
One of the things that I was also interested in about your column was that you had talked about how there are not a lot of other positions that not only face traditional industrial safety risks, but also face additional risks as a result of the social, economic, and political forces kind of at play. I wanted to ask if you could expand on that a little bit, about how, these workers face these additional outside forces rather than just sort of your regular manufacturing employee.
Exactly. So there's a number of layers of complexity that come with the transition from an illegal environment moving into a legal and regulated environment. So, for example, many of the people that have the appropriate technical skills for growing cannabis would have gained those skills when they were working in the illegal market before it was legal to produce here in the United States. In that environment, they're not used to working within a regulated health and safety framework, for example, and so the ways that one would have worked in one's garage or backyard or something like that, you just can't follow those same procedures and be compliant with the health and safety regulations. And so in some cases there's a lack of knowledge of how one operates in a way that is compliant with the health and safety regulations, because you've been used to working in an environment where those regulations did not apply. Similarly, from the point of view of someone who is a worker, if you have been working in an illegal industry, there's really no one that you can go to say, hey, my workplace is unsafe. And
Right.
so you get used to just working in conditions that are unsafe, and don't necessarily speak up now that you're in a regulated environment. You just don't have those same expectations for a safe workplace. They're really invested in the industry as well. Many of them are doing this job because they love cannabis. They think it's great. They think everyone should have access to it. And because they want the industry to be successful, that means that they may be a little bit less likely to complain about unsafe working conditions because they don't want to bring trouble to their employees.
Oh, that's a good point. Like, I never really thought about that, about how their passions could also play against them a little bit, because they're willing to do anything to make it move forward. I was also interested in how you have previously spoken about funding future studies to make it a safer environment and using the tax revenue that some of these states are bringing in. Could you talk a little bit about, sort of how that tax revenue is possibly being used now and how it could really benefit the industry going forward if it was, used to focus on safety a bit more?
Sure. So there's the states that have legalized, particularly recreational use of cannabis, are getting a very substantial income stream from the tax revenue. So here in Washington State, for example, the revenue that our state receives from cannabis sales exceeds the total revenue that we get from alcohol and tobacco sales combined. So that's a very large income stream for the state. When the voters in Washington State approved the initiative that legalized recreational use in the state, that part of that initiative envisioned setting aside a percentage of the tax revenue for research on public health related to cannabis health and safety. And so some of that was to try and understand what the detrimental effects to society might be associated with increased cannabis use. But that public health rubric also includes ensuring that the people that are producing the product are protected and that there's adequate health and safety for those producers. In Washington State, unfortunately, very little of that money that the voters had envisioned going towards research for the industry has actually gone towards the industry. Most of it has been used to fill other expenses within the state's budget. I feel that given the amount of revenue that the state is generating from the cannabis industry, that it really is incumbent upon the state to reinvest some of that, a higher proportion of that money in the industry to ensure that do the research that is necessary to ensure that we can produce this product in a way that is safe and healthy, both for the workers that are doing the production and for the consumers of the product.
One of the questions I always like to ask, and you had kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier when you talked about the passion that a lot of the workers have within the industry. What drew you particularly to the cannabis side of the business?
So professionally, I was drawn to it initially because this was a new industry in the state. It's not very often that a new industry comes along, and so there was kind of the excitement of trying to understand what these new processes were, to try and understand what the health and safety risks associated with those new processes might be, and to help the employers and the workers figure out ways to control those hazards so that the workers would be kept safe and healthy. I can say that it's really been a privilege and an honor to be able to work with the employers and their workers that I've had the opportunity to work with here in the state. I've found that, as I mentioned earlier on, that in general, most of the employers are really enthusiastic about allowing health and safety researchers to come in to look at their processes, to talk with them and their workers about those processes, and to figure out collaboratively how to do things, how to develop best practices in terms of occupational health and safety for the industry.
What are your expectations, over the next year, the next 5 years, for the industry in general?
So I think there is now greater confidence that the industry will keep moving forward. I think initially, at least here in Washington State and in Colorado as well, we would have been concerned that at some point the feds were just going to swoop in and shut things down. But I think that the growth in the industry across the US has been so phenomenal, and there's so much demand for cannabis products now that I don't see us going back. Mm-hmm. I think that we're now at a point where there's enough of the country is on board with this as being an industry here in the U.S. That we will start to see more acceptance from the federal agencies. Whether or not the federal government agrees with it, it is a fact that the people working in the industry, they are American workers, and they deserve the same protections that workers in any other industry within the U.S. have. So I foresee a continued collaborative effort to better understand and control those hazards, both to the workers, but also better understanding how to control the production processes so that we have consistent, well-documented products that are safe for the consumer.
Well, thank you very much for taking your time today. I really do appreciate it, and I know that it's going to be very beneficial to our readers. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Awesome. Well, I'm David Manti, and this has been Cannabis Equipment News. Thank you very much today, Chris.